Good evening, everyone. I'm Debbie Douglas. I'm the Director of Collections and the Curator of Science and Technology at the MIT Museum. And I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for this evening's program. This is a launch. I think this is the official first public event associated with the launch of our good friend Don Eyles' wonderful new memoir. It's called Sunburst and Luminary, an Apollo memoir. And Don is going to talk for a while about the book and share some slides. Then he'll answer some questions. And in the back, there's a table, and we will then commence with the most fun activity for an author, which is to autograph books. And if you need a copy, our gift shop is happy to sell them to you. Don has written a wonderful book, and I say this as someone privileged to read it over the Christmas break. It's as a curator who has a hodgepodge collection of MIT Instrumentation Laboratory artifacts, this book is a gift. It contains a lot of information about artifacts in our collection, and I'm thrilled to have it. It's very useful. As a historian of technology, I'm equally impressed with an account that does not stint on personal details. Technology doesn't spring from the void. Human beings make and use technology, and the passions that shape and are shaped by the artifacts they develop and deploy. And this book is filled with rich personal details, and I think it's a model for others contemplating memoirs about technological accomplishments. And as a friend, I'm thrilled to be able to celebrate the awesome accomplishment of getting words on paper and seeing them printed. Any of you that have attempted that in this audience, it is a daunting task. Even for those of you that love to write, the process of getting those words down and then getting them organized and edited and then printed and published, and things like ISBN numbers and publication, it's very challenging. So, congratulations and well done. It's a triumph. Now, Don came to MIT in June of 1966, shortly after July 1st, shortly after graduating from Boston University. And I just made a couple of notes here that the man who interviewed him, that's John McCarthy, didn't really care that he had never programmed a computer before. It turns out very few people had at this time, and so he was more intrigued, he and his colleagues were more intrigued by your love of puzzle solving and mathematical abilities. And he ended up working with Alan Klump on what is, I believe, the most complicated and dangerous phase of the entire Apollo mission. And that is the point at which you go from orbiting the moon to landing on the moon. So from about 49,000 feet to zero. It takes about, 5 minutes or so?
No, 12 to 15.
12 to 15 minutes. So it is a 12 to 15 minutes. Your talk will just exceed that period just a little bit, but not by much. So imagine the time clock clicking and the astronauts in the various missions making this final stage of descent. Don's going to share some of the details of this work, enough that I hope that you really do run enthusiastically to buy a copy of this book and share it with your colleagues. It's wonderful to welcome you here to the museum, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Debbie. That was lovely. I almost didn't recognize myself, but So welcome to Pi Day or Sunburst and Luminary Day. Who knows what those terms refer to? Peter Valenti does. Peter is in the book. I'm not sure there's anyone else here who's in the book except David Chandler, my good friend, who read the outline back in 1980 something, which was.
Are they different versions of the Apollo computer code or the Apollo computer?
Yes, they're names of two of the programs. So the programs had names. The LIM programs that actually flew were Sunburst, which flew on the LIM 1 flight, an unmanned mission that was not entirely successful. Sundance, which was sort of an interim program that I left out of the title because it never flew with the lunar landing code. And finally, Luminary, which flew every mission starting with Apollo 10. And this month is significant in many ways, I suppose, but one of the ways is that it was the month in which Luminary started. Some people think of these programs as being different for each mission, but that wasn't really the case. They were, you could think of it as one edifice, so to speak, that kept getting elaborated and improved and debugged as we went along. And so there is a direct relationship from the very early ropes, as we call them, because of the sort of memory they were encoded in, all the way through to the last Luminary, which was Luminary Revision 210, which flew on Apollo 15, 16, and 17. It was an interesting year, 1968. You know, I think many of us are aware that in 16 months, there'll be the hoopla of the 50th anniversary of the first landing. And if we look back exactly 50 years from today, we haven't flown yet. We haven't flown a man yet. The first manned mission would be in Apollo 7 in October of 1968. And followed by the other missions in quick succession. To give some background, it was back in 1961 that Alan Shepard had his suborbital flight, and right after that, Kennedy announced the goal of landing on the moon. In the same month, July 1, 1966, as we said, was when I started at the Draper Lab, at the Instrumentation Laboratory, as it was then, founded by Doc Draper, but not yet named after him. As a little bit to my surprise, and perhaps to your surprise, there was the LIM programming. I should say the LIM programming dedicated to the mission was barely starting at that point. So it was a very lucky time for me to come along and be hired. And I was hired by a man named George Cherry, whose job was who was the project manager for the LIM software. I was interviewed by two people. One of them wanted somebody for analysis. I'm not sure what that would have turned into. And George's idea was that I would help write some of the LIM code. And so that was the option that I took. In January of 1967, 50 years ago, way back a couple of Januaries ago, was the Apollo 1 fire. By now there would have been manned missions if it hadn't been for that, but that led to a very thorough rethinking of especially of the command module, which set things back. Other interesting facts, April 67, Surveyor 3 landed on the moon. That was one of the precursor missions of unmanned spacecraft that landed on the moon. I mentioned that particular one because that's the one that Apollo 12 in November of 1969 visited and brought back some parts from. And on November of 67 was the first Saturn V flight. I was in the hospital under intense painkillers because I'd just broken my leg the day before, practically 2 days before. And then we got into 68, and in January was an anticlimax. It's what I actually begin the book with, oddly enough, of the LIM 1 mission, the unmanned LIM. Our software was on board. We would have flown a simulated lunar landing, a burn in Earth orbit, which wouldn't have actually gone anywhere, but we could tell by analysis whether or not the guidance equation worked right. But it never happened because we started the engine, the LIM's decent engine, for the very first time, and it was immediately cut off. And it turned out that the code that did that was mine. It wasn't my mistake. It was the fact that an operational decision had been made to delay the arming of the engine. Nobody told us. Hey, Greg. No one told us, and as a result, the Delta V monitor, as it was called, was tuned too tight and concluded prematurely that the engine had failed, sent the engine off signal. Houston was not working perhaps as tenaciously or as flexibly as they were at a later point, and so they turned off the primary guidance system and conducted the rest of the mission under manual control from Earth. And so that would have been the first time substantial software of mine ran, but it didn't. And so the next time that any big amount of software that I was personally involved in ran was Apollo 11, so we did that without a rehearsal, so to speak. Now, where I was in the timeline, the next event, well, I already mentioned the first Luminary made as a version of Sundance, and that was the point where we were really programming for the moon rather than Earth orbit. In early April 3 is an interesting day because that was the 1968. That was the day the movie 2001 was released. The very next day was April 4th, and it's a day that sort of expresses what that year was like because I happened to be at Cape Canaveral for that and saw the second Saturn V take off. It was not a totally successful mission, but it was certainly a spectacular launch. And it was only the second one. The first one had done damage to the pad and actually scared people. So we waited with some apprehension, and it got off the ground just fine, but had some engine failures on its way to orbit that had to be solved. When I say it was a mixed day, when I got back to my motel that night, I turned on the television and learned that Martin Luther King had been killed in Memphis that same day. And in fact, 68 was a dark year in a lot of ways. We had that assassination. Robert Kennedy was killed that same year. The Democratic Convention in Chicago, and LBJ decided not to run again after nearly losing New Hampshire to the anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy. So he announced that I think also in March, announced that he was not running. And in November, Nixon was elected president. Now, later this year, if we're looking back 50 years, we had the Apollo 7 mission, which was successful, although it was a stressful mission, and Apollo 8, which was a famous, fantastic mission, really, where instead of wasting the third Saturn V on a Earth orbit mission, NASA management had the balls to send the spacecraft, just the command module, to lunar orbit. And those of us who were alive then probably remember that mission very well. The reading of the King James Bible in lunar orbit, brought goosebumps to atheists. And of course, the next year, 69, was a string of successes. Apollo 9, mission with the LIM in Earth orbit. Apollo 10, which was in lunar orbit and did everything except the final burn. And then 11 that landed on the moon in July 20th. And to doubly meet Kennedy's challenge, Apollo 12 that landed on the moon very precisely in November. I'm sorry, in November. And the goal was to land close enough to Surveyor 3 to actually walk over to it, which Pete Conrad was able to do. And so on through the missions. The last Apollo, after that, after 69, for various reasons, the pace slowed down. For one thing, the next mission, Apollo 13, was not a success, as we all know. not a successful mission. It was a successful comeback from extreme peril and a spectacular mission, but not really a success. And it was probably about the time that I started thinking about writing seriously about the moonshot. Apollo 14, which was in February of 1971, brought me 15 minutes of fame. Rolling Stone sent Tim Krause to interview me and write a story, which he did. And then when I realized that I was going to be going to the Cape for the launch of Apollo 17, I called Jan Winter, who was the proprietor of Rolling Stone, and said, let me write you a piece. And he politely allowed me to do that. They didn't run it. They paid me a small kill fee. But that may have contributed to his idea to assign Tom Wolfe to cover the Apollo project. And so it may possibly have been one of and those articles were subsequently, although much different, turned into the book, The Right Stuff. So I may have had some small role in causing that to happen. I did bring some slides. How am I doing on time?
You're doing great.
How much longer do I have?
All night, Don.
Okay. I was told that I should speak for half an hour and then ask for questions, which, okay. Well, I'm gonna bring up some slides, and the cover of the book, of course. That's the scruffy, nondescript building in which most of the Apollo work was done, or at least all the software work. That building faced the river on Cambridge Parkway. From the cars, and also the windows of the building. By the time I was there, the windows had been changed, but it gives you an idea of the era. I think the newest of those cars are probably close to 1960 or 61. Somebody might correct me. And
than 60.
What?
Earlier than 60.
Earlier than 60? The what? Yeah. No, long ago, replaced by fancy buildings. I'm not even sure Cambridge Parkway is still there. I suspect this was taken. This was from the lab's files. I suspect this was taken when the lab was getting ready to move into the building or acquire the building or lease the building, as they did. And that is where, that's a IBM 026 key punch machine. It may surprise you. I'm not sure what you're picturing. Maybe you're picturing monitors on our desks. No such thing. That was how we programmed the Apollo guidance computer, and everything else we programmed in those days was with a key punch machine. Has anybody here used key punch machines? I know Peter has. Okay, well, that's good. And you got to understand the machine, and it became sort of second nature. That's sort of an arbitrary sample of code. The book that's over there that Debbie was showing off earlier is an entire program. 2 different versions of Luminary. There were 2 different computer languages. I won't try to explain in detail, but at this point right here, there's a transition from the assembler language to an interpretive language that was very efficient in memory for doing vector matrix type operations, but not efficient in time. Excuse me, a vector cross product took, I believe, 5 milliseconds. And that, although we have the real thing over there, that's a listing of Luminary, about 6 inches thick, green bar paper. You could have a copy printed using carbon paper like the museum's copy, but you didn't really want that because they were, they got your hands dirty, and it was tough to separate the copies. And to the side there is a copy of the standard coding form and Hugh Blairsmith's famous memo, Memoir number 9. which was sort of the Bible for the assembly code. And Hugh Blair-Smith himself was right there to question. And Charlie Muntz, who wrote the interpreter, the onboard code that implemented the interpretive language I showed you, he was around the corner. So at least the horse's mouth was accessible, and you could, you know, Hugh would talk to you for hours about it. Oh, and a Coca-Cola, which was my own private drink. These are pictures of what we called our hybrid simulator in Cambridge. And on the left, the color picture, that's our LIM cockpit. It's made of plywood, but it does have all the controls that were important for running the guidance system. The control sticks, the various mode switches that impacted the guidance system. That door in the back, the upper of those gray boxes mounted on the door is where, corresponds to where the computer would have been mounted on a real LIM. But the actual computer that was running this simulation was in one of those cabinets to the upper right. And you'll see that here in the cockpit is the DISCI, the display and keyboard unit, which was the flexible means of communication between the astronaut and the computer. And up on that middle, or the next to the right-hand cabinet, is another DISCI. And so we were able to run simulations from the lab itself without using the cockpit, unless there were things where we needed the cockpit inputs for. We called it the hybrid simulation because it combined analog computers and digital computers, hence the hybrid. And that's a Beckman analog computer in that lower photograph. You see those panels with wires dangling out of them. That's how it was programmed. A voltage level represented a variable. If you opened up the cabinets, some of the cabinets, you could see an array of potentiometers, and the setting of that potentiometer corresponded to the magnitude of the variable. And you can also see the strip chart, sort of a polygraph machine, which gave us insight into what was happening inside the analog computer. Here's NASA's version. And I had the fun of using that machine quite a bit in the later days. What's painted green pertains to the lunar module. The cabinets contain computers and visual devices, but inside that irregular cluster of boxes in the foreground, which the astronaut John Young called the Great Train Wreck, but in the core of that is a very realistic LIM cockpit. And the point of all those boxes, or many of them, is to create a visual display for the LIMS windows, the LIMS front windows, two of them, big windows for a spacecraft, and also for the docking window, which was a smaller window that was, as you stand in the LIM, directly overhead. You can sort of see a red carpet and a couple of chairs. You don't see the stairway that started at that point, but that was where you left your shoes and climbed the carpeted stairway and went in, again, the back door into the cabin. And since some of the work I was doing at the later part of Apollo couldn't really be done with our own simulators, I spent a fair amount of time with that one. You know, I've flown in the best fixed-base simulator that there was, I would say scores of lunar landings, maybe hundreds, as we worked out different things, sometimes with an astronaut. I flew with Pete Conrad, with Dave Scott, and with John Young quite a bit.
What's the brown part?
There were two command module simulators. One of them is behind the camera, and the brown stuff is the other one. Similar arrangement. Inside the big cluster of boxes, there was a command module cockpit. John.
Can you see and hear the camera rig that did the simulated landscape?
Yeah, that sort of affair that's behind the cluster of boxes but painted green, that contained a relief map of the lunar terrain around the planned landing spot. There were lights in the proper position to represent the sun. There was a moving platform, two-dimensional platform below that, which contained a TV camera. So altitude was represented by the up and down motion of the lunar terrain, which was upside down inside of that device. And the two-dimensional movement of the TV camera represented the other dimensions with respect to the landscape. There were some jokes played with that. When Willy Brandt, the German premier, came to visit for his VIP tour, somebody put a toy Volkswagen service garage near the landing site. So as they landed, and there was another occasion when Charlie Duke and John Young were going to be flying in the simulator, and somebody had found a dead frog in the flower bed outside, and had stuck the dead frog on the terrain near the landing site. And Charlie Duke was in on the joke, but John Young wasn't. So that, I wasn't there, unfortunately, but I'm sure it was an amusing thing. Where those people are clustered, that's the console, and you could fly the thing from there if you really wanted to. But that also allowed the conductor of the simulation to put in malfunctions of various sorts from a big book that sat there. Let's go to the next one. Okay, well, I probably should have brought this up first, but that's the computer itself, front and back views. It's a cubic foot. That's about 2 feet by 6 inches by a foot. And you can see in the right-hand picture how the modules that contain the actual code slip in. There's a module over there. Let me get it. Thanks. This would have contained about 1/6 of Luminary. Luminary was 36K words. They were 16-bit words. So that's twice 36, 76 kilobytes divided into 6 of these. Oh yeah, it says so right there. So this is about 1/6 of the entire code for a mission, and this is 12 kilobytes.
How do they get punch cards into the computer?
Oh, good question. No, there was some processing in between. As I said, these assemblies were things that kept growing as more stuff was added. When we released one, the information went to Raytheon, where a corps of little old ladies, as they were called, pardon my ageism, wove this memory. I don't have a picture of the memory. There's an exhibit on the table that represents it. But it was a kind of memory where, depending on whether a given wire passed through or around a core, it represented a 1 or a 0. So it was and then those were potted, of course, filled in with solid material. So it was a very durable, reliable form of memory, but not very dense. And that was fixed memory. That couldn't be changed. That was read-only memory. The entire computer had 2K words, 4K in bytes of RAM, of erasable memory, where variables were kept and so on. Yeah?
Was that the origin of the term hardwired?
I don't think so. I think people were probably using the term hardwired before that, I would guess. Okay, those modules get put into the computer. Everything else has gotten ready, and the thing takes off. I was privileged to see 4 of those, and it never got dull. I don't think I'll go through this in detail, but this represents the mission to the moon. I'm not showing the part back. There's this interesting, there's the launch. You go around the Earth a time or two, check out systems, and then fire the 3rd stage engine for the 2nd time to get on a course for the moon. And one of the first things that happens is that the spacecraft takes itself apart, and the lunar module separates. The command module separates. The command module being the cone-shaped part that contains the people, separates completely, turns around and noses back in. You can sort of seeing that happening in one of those images, and extracts joins up with the limb and extracts it from the 3rd stage. And the 3rd stage is then independent and usually ends up impacting the moon. But the 2 spacecraft continue into orbit, stay in lunar orbit, do a burn to lower the orbit, and then do the 2nd longer burn to descend to the surface. Okay, now I'll get into people a little bit. Let me go in a different order. George Cherry is on the left. That's the only photograph that we've been able to find in the lab files of George Cherry, except for one other where he's half hidden by someone. And George was I think it's fair to say he was a little bit of a driven and maybe not too happy person. And I think this is evidence that he was probably as well camera shy. In 2000 and something, he talked to me about his life a bit. So did Alan, about their early life, and I put some of that in the book. He said, the Army saved me from being a bus driver. He was down and out and found his way into an Army recruitment office, and they tested his IQ, which was pretty high, and offered him officer school. He said no, he wanted to be an enlisted person to get the education, the technical education. He went from there to teaching surface-to-air missiles in Von Braun's shop in Huntsville. And at some point heard Dick Batten, who will be on the next slide, talking about the Apollo mission, and he got hired and made some very important contributions in addition to hiring me. He was a leader in the autopilot design, a very advanced design for the autopilot, which is the part of the system that stabilizes the spacecraft in a given orientation, such that the lab, MIT, was able to take over the autopilot part of the job as well. And sort of his successor, not really a successor, but by the time I came along, George he also originated, I should have said, the lunar landing guidance equation, the equation itself. But then he sort of became more of a manager, in which capacity he hired me, and Alan Klump on the right took over the lunar landing and sort of turned George's equation into a practical system. And I worked very closely with Klump throughout the entire period. We used to say, how do you land on the moon? Klump. And I'll go back. This is Dick Batten on the left, who I think it's fair to say is, or was, because he died a few years ago, the astrodynamics expert of the world. And Hal Lanning, who, in terms of computer science, was at least the equivalent. He created the first compiler. He designed what you'd call the operating system of the Apollo spacecraft. And it was really, they were sort of august personages way above me while I was working, but in later years we became, in the tennis court, good friends, and I miss them both. And Doc Draper, who, again, at that point was was our ultimate leader. I love this photograph. This was taken by me at the launch of Apollo 15 at the Cape. You see the mission patch in color up there. He's talking to a woman named Mary Bubb, who I think he's known for years at this point, who for every mission, she worked for, I'm pulling a blank, I can't remember who she worked for. She was a journalist. She created a hat based on the mission patch. And I don't know if you can see it in that picture, but the red, white, and blue chevrons that are in the patch have been translated into those higher parts of her hat with sort of a gray lunar globe behind. And not to forget the guys who were brave enough to put their rear ends on the line. I thought I'd throw up the Apollo 12 LIM crew. That's Pete Conrad on the left, who was an amusing character for everybody who got to know him, and Al Bean on the right, who flew to the moon on Apollo 12. The crews were, from where I sat, the crews were different. You know, some more outgoing than others. I never, you know, beyond a few conversations, I never had too much to do with the Apollo 11 crew, but I got to know this crew quite a bit better in crew training meetings and even flying the simulator. The 13 crew, headed by Jim Lovell, I didn't see very much of. But there was a very amusing crew training meeting for Apollo 14 and for Apollo 15, and so on. So I'm almost at the end. Well, let's see. Let me go back. I just thought I'd put up a picture of the LIM, which, you know, not everybody found beautiful, but it was our baby, and I took pride in it. Yeah, and I think this is my final. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. I think this was my final slide. This is from Apollo 17, and it's taken from about 3 kilometers distant from the LIM with a 500 millimeter lens on a Hasselblad. But that small object in the middle is the LIM. That mission got how far? 7 kilometers away from the LIM at its maximum using the lunar rover, which to me is about as far out on a limb as anybody has ever gone to be 7 kilometers and out of sight of your way back to Earth. Impresses me. Yeah, the last mission. And so that's all I've got, but in terms of a prepared presentation, but I'm here for you to ask questions as long as they'll let this persist.
Love to have you ask questions, and because we're recording this occasion, I'd love to pass the mic around so that your question might get included in those remarks. So any comments or questions for Don?
Don, hi. Could you talk about a moonshot and how that relates to anything you worked on, if you did work on?
Say what?
Where you would use like a moonshot or some passing past a body in order to use the gravitational pull to come back
slingshot.
Around. Yes, yeah. Like slingshot.
That didn't really figure in. Steve Hollinger, he asks about the slingshot maneuver, whereby going by way of Venus, let us say, you can get to Mars using less fuel. Dick Batten, in 1961, the man on the left is the person who invented that, who first created, some of the ideas came from Hal Lanning, because the lab pre-Apollo, before Apollo existed, had done a study of a Mars mission. And as part of the paper about that, Hal Lanning had suggested that you could get a gain, you could get a velocity change out of passing by another body. And Dick took that further and actually worked out a practical trajectory for getting to Mars by way of Venus. The idea is that instead of going uphill to Mars, because Mars is further from the sun than us, you go downhill towards the sun to Venus, which is easier, but by swinging around Venus, it changes your path so that you're now heading back out in the away from the sun direction. The maneuver is symmetrical with respect to Venus, but it's not symmetrical with respect to the sun. So you do get to Mars more easily that way. But it didn't really figure in Apollo.
Can I ask a question about how you moved between the code as page and then the code as punch cards? I've read through the code a fair amount, and you reflect on, or you and your co-authors, right, reflect on the code on the page as well as on the card. And what was that like, moving back and forth between cards and pages? And did you print it out frequently and edit in that way?
I'm an advocate for paper, by the way, but there was a program written by Hugh Blair-Smith called the Assembler. And basically, as I say, we were always adding and elaborating, the given thing. So basically, you submitted to the assembler change cards, punched cards, which, using line numbers and things of that sort, determined where that new code should go. The assembler then mulled all that over. If it all checked out, would create a tape, and that tape could be used in the simulators. Oh, thank you. That tape could go to the simulators, and when a roper is released for a mission, the tape would go to Raytheon for manufacture. And so we didn't have a terminal to look at, we had paper to look at. And so we got to know those big books pretty well. When I say I'm sort of an advocate for paper, I worry about the history of our digital age, in the sense that future generations, future governments, if you will, prioritize maintaining this data. Paper can last 1,000 years without maintenance. Digital data cannot, and it costs money to maintain it. So that, to me, is a possible problem. So I'm all for paper. Anyway, next.
Can you talk a little bit about the extent to which the computer flew the landings and the pilots versus the pilots flying them?
That's a good question, and David Mendel's book basically is about that, a book called Digital Apollo. David was here a few minutes ago, but I think he had to leave. Okay. Well, he's heard all this many times before. The real piloting came at the end of the landing. The man, without the help of the computer, would not have been able to fly an efficient enough trajectory to get down with the amount of fuel that was available. So until the spacecraft gets down to the neighborhood of 400 or 500 feet, it's pretty well fully automatic. The astronaut is monitoring things, has the ability to ask for information from the computer. There are 3 stages to the landing. There's lighting the engine. The next point is called high gate, and between lighting the engine and high gate, which is 3/4 of the whole landing, for a lot of that he can't even see the surface because the spacecraft is pitched back and he's looking up. But then at high gate, the spacecraft, the guidance targets are switched, the result of which is that the spacecraft becomes a more straight up posture. It's still changing, moving from tilted back to being straight up. But during that period, the astronaut can see the moon in front of him. And there was a method by tweaking a hand controller, the astronaut could say, move the landing site left, right, downrange, uprange. And so he had some limited amount of piloting ability during that phase. Neil Armstrong said he would use that once to show the engineers it worked, but he only used it once. Pete Conrad went to town with it. Apollo 11, for various reasons, didn't come anywhere near the planned landing site, but it was nevertheless a triumph. During the final part, from 400 feet or so down, it really was stick and rudder flying. The computer was still helping with the throttle, but in terms of horizontally moving across the surface, it was using the control stick, somewhat like flying a helicopter.
Thank you. Don, could you tell briefly, if possible, the story of Alan Klump's phone call to Jim Lovell before Apollo 13? Because I think it says something important about the program as it went on in those days.
Peter Valenti, who knows all about it himself, wants me to talk about Alan Klump's faux pas in early 71. I haven't talked much about it, but one of the most teachable moments in the whole Apollo time with respect to the guidance computer is Apollo 11 and the overload alarms that it had, and which were the result of a sort of a sneak circuit in the electronics, if you want to put it that way. So following Apollo 11, we were spending a lot of time thinking about the time problem and what the possible bad effects of not having enough processor time could be. Meanwhile, I hasten to add, we had figured out what caused the Apollo 11 problem, and so that had been fixed. So we didn't have any other likely sources of time stealing, as happened on 11. But just the same, we started thinking about how to make the system more proof against that kind of problem. And Alan did some very thorough research in which he discovered a number of failure modes, not even failure modes, a number of cases in which if things happen in just the wrong way, wrong commands could be issued, which could have had a serious effect. Alan was intent on making sure that Apollo 13 didn't have this problem. He did not think that NASA was doing enough in terms of approving his ideas. And so one morning he called up Jim Lovell at the crew office in Houston and told Lovell about this. And it was regarded as a faux pas. I think it was a faux pas. Because Lovell did not handle the information as discreetly as Alan might have wished. And so it caused sort of a blow up. I had a part in it. I didn't have a part in it, but I was a witness to what happened after that. I was suddenly asked by Bruce McCoy, one of our managers, to cover a meeting in Houston. I didn't know why he wasn't going, but I went and did it. And then I figured out why, which was that there was going to be a briefing at the Cape for the Apollo 13 crew to sort of allay their fears that Alan had planted. Alan Klump was invited not to attend. I heard about it in Houston and realized I could get to the Cape in time, which I did. At that point, I was sort of writing my own ticket in a way, and no one seemed to mind that I was there. So I was at a briefing in crew quarters at the Cape one evening where Russ Larson, who had taken over from George Cherry, basically explained the problem to the crew and sort of just to acquaint them with it. Jim Lovell said that if anything started going wrong, he would just switch to the AGS, the abort guidance system, and so the initiative was sort of lost. It sort of spring-loaded Lovell to take control away from the primary system, which which probably would not have happened because it probably would have been a successful landing if Apollo 13 had been able to attempt a landing, which of course it wasn't. It was enough to get home alive.
You've talked a lot about the landing on the moon. Can you talk about the other half of the mission, which is taking off from the moon and rendezvousing with the command module and for getting back to Earth?
Yeah, the LIM takes off, gets into lunar orbit, does a few maneuvers, which are confirmed by the ground, but which are calculated on board. The LIM is the active vehicle, catches up with the command module, hooks up with it. The LIM is discarded and impacts the moon, usually at a known point, so it helps calibrate the seismographs. And the command module burns out of lunar orbit, coasts for 3 days, hits the atmosphere just right, pops, shoots, and drops in the ocean.
The code that you were involved with was used for that as well?
No,
It was not?
no.
That was a whole different part of the code?
It was a whole different part of the code. I mean, there were a few odds and ends that I wrote that were involved in it, but nothing important. That was Larry Berman. I wonder where Larry is these days. He coded the P-12, which was the normal ascent from the moon. And then there was a whole group of people working on rendezvous. Who should I mention for rendezvous? You?
That was rendezvous navigation.
Mm-hmm.
Was it a different computer used for
No, the same computer, different programs in the same computer. The computer was organized into P programs. The lunar landing was the P-60s, P-63, P-64, and usually P-66 for the final landing. But there were a different set of programs for targeting and executing the rendezvous. The P-40s were for orbital maneuvers, and so on.
So Apollo 14, the story of the intermittent short circuits of the abort button. Could you tell us, where you were when you heard about this emergency or contingency, and then what you did next, and how did you feel when you realized that it all worked out?
Yeah, that's funny, of course, because the Apollo 14 story has been mistold over and over. One version has me asleep at home. My apartment, by the way, was on Beacon Hill. An Air Force car comes, pulls in my driveway, and knocks on my door. I pull a bathrobe over my pajamas, and I'm rushed to the lab where I work out this solution. But there's no way, of course, that I would have been at home, much less asleep, with a lunar landing that was about to use my software about to happen. I was at the lab, ready to go in and monitor my phase of the mission, but I was in my office working on something else when Bruce McCoy, who I mentioned earlier, came and said, "Oh, the abort discrete has appeared." And I said, "Uh-huh." And then he came back a few minutes later and said, "The abort discrete's still appearing." And at that point, we went to the office next door where there was one of these listings of the exact code that was on board, and looked at it, and I saw that the only way, you see the abort button, which had this short circuit in it due to some metallic contamination that was floating around. If you press that, the computer would sense that within 2 seconds, and then would initiate the abort programs. There was an abort stage program. The abort program used the descent engine. Started with the descent engine. The abort stage button would immediately discard the descent stage and do the abort on the ascent engine. But the switch had to be sensed by the computer. And again, lucky me, I'd written the code that looked at the switch. And so it was my own code that I had to defeat. And I saw that the only way you could prevent the code from running at all was for it to think that an abort was already in progress. So that was the workaround, to basically set a register that suggested, that kind of indicated the abort was in progress. Fortunately, that could be done without actually touching off an abort because of the way all this worked. And then let the engine get lit up, let the landing begin, and then basically fix it. Which you could, once you had passed the ignition point, you could then, in a more proper way, turn off the abort's monitor. And so that's what happened. The first step was to say that P-71 was in progress. We went through ignition, through throttle up that way, and then did a bunch of keystroke sequences to basically clean up afterwards.
When did you know that it worked, and how did you feel when you realized that it all worked out?
Well, we were pretty sure it worked because we had run it in our simulator, and NASA had run it in its simulator. There'd been a preliminary version that didn't work, but we fixed the loose end. And so as with everything else, it was simulations that gave us a strong idea that it was going to work.
I heard a story that said that.
Okay. You're next.
When that occurred, one of your coworkers, I get correctly, predicted that as soon as they fired the engine, the stuff at the switch would go away and everything would go back to normal. Is that true?
I don't remember any of my colleagues predicting that. I don't know who might have predicted that. From my point of view, the contamination could have gone the other way.
Yeah.
And the point where you lit the engine was obviously going to create some vibration. So it seemed to me it was totally unpredictable and dangerous to assume anything.
This wasn't suggest not taking the step. It was just a
Somebody who knew the way that switch worked might have been able to make that guess.
Okay. Question on the last 3 Apollo missions. You mentioned that you were spending more time in Houston. What was the nature and scope of the work? I mean, the landing sites were more challenging, amazing places on the moon.
It didn't really have too much to do with the landing sites. And by the way, I was referring to the Cape, not to Houston. That big simulator I showed you was at the Flight Crew Support Building at Cape Canaveral. I think you can see it on some of the tours if you go there, because I think it sort of still exists as a exhibit. But as I may have said, the last 3 missions were flown with the same version of Luminary 210, the last Luminary, but we were working on something that we called erasable memory programs. The way I look at it now, the real function was to keep our mind in the game, so to speak. But the idea was that we would have a catalog of these erasable memory programs. They're called that because you could execute code from fixed memory from these things, but you could also execute code that was in the RAM memory. And there were areas in RAM memory that we knew the program well enough by that point. We knew that there were buffers that would never be used where 60-odd words of code could be put and could be executed. So these were, by definition, small programs that were there to handle various malfunctions that we could think of a way to handle by having some extra code, such as malfunctions of the CDUs, which was what we call the analog to digital converters that gave us the angles from the IMU, and there were actually ways of getting, when you were thrusting, you could do without one of the IMU angles because you knew which way the thrust was, because you knew where the engine was and so on. And there was another one, there was apparently some potential malfunction in which the radar data would be 5 times as great as it was supposed to be. So that was another simple one. You just got in at the right point and divided by 5. So there was, I don't remember how many of these, there were a few dozen, I think, maybe 100 by the end that we had worked out. And so mostly I was working on things like that. I also, prior to Luminary 210, the astronaut John Young had a really good idea, which I talk about a little bit in the book, which would have made landing accurately even easier. And by using by having a way in the final landing program, P-66, to sort of coast along, and when a certain sight angle passed the point where you wanted to land, flip a mode switch, the spacecraft would then automatically null out its velocities and land there. And this was his idea. These were the days when an astronaut could find a tame software engineer and we could actually work up something like this in a matter of a few weeks and fly it on that very accurate, elaborate simulator, which had there it is, which had visual displays good enough. The visual display system worked very well. Had displays that were good enough for actually doing that. So those were things that I did a lot of flying there about.
Hi, I've got two questions. One is a brief follow-up to the previous question, your abort problem solving. For us non-engineer, non-techie minds, we were thinking, okay, we got a week to solve this, find this problem. You had how long to find that problem?
A few hours.
Okay, yeah, still impressive. And then the other one was, just to put all of this in context, I mean, we know that NASA and the space program is we are all benefiting and learning from that, but what technological advances or what was in place for the public during the time that you were using all these programming methods and computing equipment, and you can't really say software, but just to give us a sense of what else was going on in those times. What, in your mind, what were some of the most impressive technological advances that the public was using?
From Apollo? Good question. I would first and foremost think of integrated circuits. That computer, which I showed you before, was one of the first significant uses of integrated circuits. They were, by today's standards, very, very simple. Each integrated circuit, and I believe there were 2,800 of them in the computer, of the same type, were triple input NOR gates. That meant a device where if you had, let me see this right, if you had, if any of the inputs was a 1, you'd get a 0 out. If none of them were a 1, then you'd get a 1 out. And believe it or not, from something as simple as that, the whole computer could be built up. And the work that was done, integrated circuits were a very new thing at that point and not very reliable. So one of the very significant contributions of Apollo was methods for making integrated circuits more reliable. And in fact, the Apollo guidance computer never had an in-flight hardware failure. Never had a hardware failure of any kind that I know of. I remember one night when Peter Adler and I were working with the hybrid simulator, and we thought maybe we had detected a hardware error. And as I say, it was after hours. We went upstairs to the hardware lab and bumped into Al Hopkins, who was one of the main designers. What he did was he grabbed another computer from inventory. We marched downstairs to the hybrid lab and plugged that computer in instead of the one that was there. And the same thing happened. So we then knew that it was not a hardware failure. It was something about the hardware design. And he then got out a very large circuit diagram and figured out why we were seeing what we were seeing, which was good news that there was no hardware problem, but it was bad news because we had to look for another solution to our little problem.
Mr. Eyles, could you, based on your experiences during the Apollo program, could you offer a few words of advice for achieving technical success on other modern, unprecedented engineering challenges such as this?
Well, this is where I'd probably start sounding like an old fogey. I mean, we had a pretty unstructured work environment, and to me that was a good thing. We were allowed to be individuals. We had what we needed to do, but no one was breathing down our neck. We didn't have the ratio of managers to doers was relatively small. I think, quite small compared to the way it would be these days. Alan Klump and I could sit in his office for an hour and make a decision that would probably take, a committee in a month or two in the space station era. And so to me, sort of the freedom of our working conditions, the fact that I was able on my own to pursue this idea of John Young's that I was talking about a few minutes ago, I don't think that would, the fact that the coders were talking to the astronauts, I don't think that's something that would happen these days. So to me, and maybe I'm a romantic to say it this way, but to me the unstructuredness of the conditions we were working under were the thing that allowed us to do what we did as creatively as we did.
Hi.
Hi.
By that time, were you or your team aware that you were making history?
Yeah.
I've just looked at my watch, and I think we could go on all night with questions, but I'd really like to shift gears here for a moment, give Don a chance to take another full drink, but perhaps have more personal conversations with you and sign your books. So I'd like to ask you to join me in a round of thanks and appreciation.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you all. And Don's going to relocate himself in the back. There's a nice table there, and we'll be happy to sign books or talk to you at greater length. But we appreciate your coming to the museum tonight and look forward to seeing you at future programs as well.